Afternoon, everybody. Hello, good afternoon. Thanks for coming to our webinar, to our third webinar of this series about diversity and inclusion in the United States. My name is Elizabeth Arroyo. I'm the Education USA advisor located at the Esquina Franklin, Guadalajara. And there are also my colleagues from Education USA Mexico, Martha Beltran and Elvira Castillo from Education USA Mexico as well. And well, we welcome all of you. So you are muted and your video is turned off. Please type your questions in Q&A Martha Beltran's chat. Private chat. So we're going to have a question and answer session at the end. So you will have the opportunity for asking questions to our guest speakers today. And this session will be available on our YouTube channel as well. Next, please. Okay, so our session is called Inclusion of Students with Disabilities in U.S. Higher Education. This is a very interesting topic, and I'm sure that you will like it, and it is going to be also very useful. So, Education USA. What is Education USA? So it's a global network of advising centers from the US State Department's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. We have 26 Education USA advising centers in Mexico, and we offer free access to introductory information on US studies. Okay, these are part of our activities, and we provide one-on-one sessions, public information sessions like this one with our guest speakers today. We provide also with reference materials, books and official test guides and workshops. We provide a public information sessions, activities with US higher education institution representative and mobility fairs, and virtually. Also, there are a lot of fairs, seminars, webinars, virtual advising, and virtual workshops. Okay, we follow the 5 steps to US study that are: number 1, research your options. Number 2, finance your studies. The third one is complete your application. Number 4, apply for your student visa. And number 5, prepare for your departure. And I'd like to introduce you our guest speakers today. Welcome Stephanie Brodeur and Stephanie Baller, who are our guest speakers today. Stephanie Brodeur is the Director of Disability Services at Bentley University, and Stephanie Baller, the Associate Director of Disability Services, also at Bentley University. Stephanie Brodeur is a Director of Disability Services at Bentley University and has been at Bentley for 12 years. Prior to Bentley, Stephanie worked at a day and residential school for students with severe behavioral and mental health needs. She's certified and licensed as a rehabilitation counselor and received her MA in 2006 and her BA degree in 2005 at Assumption College in Rehabilitation Counseling. Stephanie Baller is the Associate Director of Disability Services at Bentley University and has been at Bentley for 4 years. Prior to Bentley, she spent 4 years working in accessibility services at Harvard Law School. She received her master's degree in higher education, student affairs from Salem State University in 2012, and her bachelor's degree in education at Stonehill College in 2010. It's a pleasure having you both here today.
Thank you so much. Thank you. All right, well, thank you so much for having us. So Stephanie and I, we work at Bentley University. We're located in Waltham, Massachusetts, which is a suburb of Boston. We are going to go through our some background knowledge in terms of disability and what kind of governs us in how we operate at Bentley. And then we will get into a little bit more specific information in terms of our actual process, the types of disabilities that we see, the types of accommodations that might match up to those disabilities, so that you can get a good picture of our accessibility services. So to start off, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 is the federal legislation that governs all higher education in the US. It is a civil rights law that protects people with disabilities by prohibiting discrimination based on that disability. It guarantees equal access to all programs and activities, including classes and jobs and transportation, things like that. The ADA also mandates reasonable accommodation to people with disabilities to ensure equal accessibility. So we're just going to go through some definitions. So the first is what is a disability? So it's anything that impacts activities of daily living. So this can be something as simple as breathing and walking and standing, but then it also gets into more complicated things such as learning and communicating and reading and interpreting, receiving information, processing information. And then a reasonable accommodation is a modification or adjustment to the curriculum to ensure equal access. So accommodations can be denied if there is an undue hardship or compromise the integrity of a course. So an undue hardship could be if there is too great of a financial obligation to fund the accommodation. What we find at Bentley is, and most schools in the US, is that most accommodations are not financially, they do not cause a financial hardship. Through communication and working on a one-to-one basis with the student and the school, we are typically able to accommodate. When we talk about compromising the integrity of a course, what we're talking about are things like, for example, if it's a public speaking course and the student is diagnosed with anxiety and has panic attacks while speaking. Well, we can't do a different deliverable in lieu of the presentations because it is a public speaking course. That would compromise the integrity of the course. Okay, so these are the types of disabilities that we see at Bentley. So the first one, and I would say the most popular reason students come to our office are learning disabilities. So for example, dyslexia is a learning disability in reading. Disorder of the written expression is a writing learning disability. Other types of learning disabilities can include things impacting math, impacting communication. We also serve, so ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We serve students with psychological diagnoses such as anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder. We also serve students who have medical diagnoses such as Crohn's, which is a gastrointestinal disorder, students who may have had a stroke, irritable bowel syndrome, which again is a GI disorder, diabetes, migraine headaches. We also serve students who have a physical diagnosis, which can include the blind or visually impaired, the deaf or hard of hearing, physical medical diagnoses such as multiple sclerosis. And then we also serve students with autism and Asperger's, which is a developmental disorder. Out of those disabilities, learning disabilities and ADHD are definitely the most reason students do come to see us. However, in the past, I would say 4 to 5 years, we have seen a huge increase in psychological diagnoses as well as physical and medical. And then in addition to that, the students who are diagnosed with autism and Asperger's, we have seen the numbers starting to climb as well. So more students are looking to have that higher education experience.
So what's important to note is that there are visible and then there are invisible disabilities, meaning that some disabilities can be seen with the eye while others cannot. So visible disabilities means that people outside of the person with the disability can see and identify the disability. So sometimes you can't necessarily see the medical condition, but you can see the equipment that the person uses to help manage their symptoms. So a great example, and actually what the universal symbol of disability is a wheelchair, right? The person in the wheelchair. So even though you might not know what's going on for the person physically, you can see their wheelchair and know that something is going on. Folks who are blind or visually impaired will oftentimes use assistive equipment that helps them to find their way. So for example, the white cane, maybe a guide dog. And then additionally, folks who are deaf or hard of hearing, you might see a hearing aid that assists them in hearing. Or you might see someone using sign language or speaking with their hands because that's how they communicate instead of verbally. So those are all very visible examples of disability. So then the other category that you'll find are invisible disabilities. And that means that only the person with the disability is aware unless they choose to disclose or tell people about their disability. So the learning disabilities that Stephanie was talking about, those are all things that are impacting the brain or how someone learns. You can't necessarily see that, right? Unless someone tells you, hey, I have disorder of written expression, so I need a computer. Psychiatric disabilities, things like anxiety or depression, you don't see those on someone, right? Same with the chronic medical conditions, the Crohn's, the gastrointestinal stuff. You can't see someone's insides unless you have, the special medical equipment to do that, which we don't have in our office. Things like epilepsy, unless someone has a visible seizure, that's an invisible disability. And then lastly, autism spectrum disorder or Asperger's, that is invisible, although some people will exhibit behavioral things. Some of their actions might show that they have that diagnosis, but you can't see someone on the street and go, oh, that's someone who has Asperger's just based on what they look like. Okay. So although we would love to just be able to wave a magic wand and know what to give someone for an accommodation, there is a process involved. So the first step in our process is that the student is required to send in documentation of their disability. And that's in the form of medical documentation because disabilities are a medical condition that affects a major life activity. So what we want to see is documentation from a specialist, someone who specializes in treating the condition. So if someone has a heart condition, we want something from a cardiologist, right? A specialist of the heart, not a pediatrician who's general internal medicine. So the documentation must be completed by a certified diagnostician. It has to be current. What we've determined to be current is no more than 3 to 4 years old. A lot can happen after, in big time gaps. And we also want to see, does the person have a history with the diagnosis? And most importantly, we want that diagnosis, right? We also want to see the diagnostic interview. So oftentimes for ADHD, the person has a long conversation with the doctor and answers a lot of questions about symptoms. We want to see the batteries of testing. So there's lots of different kind of tests that you can do. So for learning disabilities, there's a lot of cognitive things that assess math, reading, memory, processing skills. And then we want to know the specialist's recommendations based on those tests and those batteries and those interviews.
Okay, so what are the next steps? So once a student submits documentation, they would set up a meeting with us, Disability Services. During that, it's a very highly interactive process. So we're going to sit with the student, and typically that would be an in-person meeting. However, due to COVID and our world circumstances, Stephanie and I are actually fully remote right now. And so we have adapted all of our policies and procedures to do this via Zoom and and over the phone and do it remotely. So what we're going to do during that meeting is we're going to review the documentation and we're going to go through it with the student. We are going to ask them for their interpretations of what their history meant to them. How has their experience been in their education history? What accommodations have they received? And we're going to have them tell us a little bit about themselves. We're then going to go over the evaluation with the student and discuss the recommendations. So typically at the end of either if it's a full-on assessment or if it's a doctor's letter, the specialist is going to include specific recommendations that relate back to the diagnosis. When we're talking about approving accommodations, we want to see what is the diagnosis, what is the impact of that diagnosis, and then what accommodations are needed to level the playing field. So just because an accommodation is recommended does not mean it's accepted. So like I said, we need to see that train of thought. We need to see that continuum to ensure that we are approving those accommodations under the ADA. The accommodation does need to have a rationale, and it needs to have supported documentation. So for example, if a student is diagnosed with dyslexia, which is a reading disability, and they are recommending extra time on timed deliverables, things like exams and quizzes, we're going to look at that reading rate, which would be included in the report. And if there's a diagnosis of dyslexia, what we're going to see is a very slow reading rate as compared to their other scores. That gives us a rationale for approving such an accommodation. So what it boils down to is that we're not giving the student a leg up. We are actually leveling that playing field to give them equal access so that they have equal opportunity to complete the deliverable. I also want to note, this is a good time to note that the students who are applying for accommodations within our office are very, very smart and very, very intelligent. There is a high stigma of disability equating to less than. And Steph and I have spent the past 4 years really working with our campus and our faculty and our staff and our students to blast that stigma really out of the ground. We want to level that out. We see the IQ scores of our students, and all the students who are attending Bentley get in the same way, meaning they take the same SAT and ACTs, they do the same applications. When there is a diagnosed disability, there is typically one area that is impacted, and that is where that reasonable accommodation comes into play. So for that example of a student with dyslexia, they may have a superior IQ. Their overall IQ may be in the superior range. And you're like, wow, that student is very, very intelligent. However, when you break it down and you look at those subscores, for example, as I mentioned before, the reading rate, that might be in the 10th percentile, which means they're only scoring at the 10% of their age range, okay, and where they are in school. Then they're not at the 90th percentile, which is where their IQ is. When you see that discrepancy and we put in a little bit of extra time on time deliverables, now they have equal opportunity to demonstrate their knowledge. Okay, so once we have our little interactive process with the student, we determine what accommodations are applicable, what accommodations are necessary, what they're eligible for. We are going to provide them with an accommodation plan to confirm those accommodations. So students are able to then submit that plan to each of their professors, and then they must have a conversation with each professor to review their accommodation plan. And we do this for several reasons. One, we really want our students to learn to start advocating for themselves, specifically students who have been accommodated in the K through 12 setting, kindergarten through high school. It's very normal for the family in the US to drive that accommodation process, and the student doesn't typically have a lot of interaction with that. And so once they come to higher education, the laws change, the expectations change, and that's all around, including disability services. So we're going to start to teach our students how to advocate for themselves. So they will submit that plan, which outlines the legally mandated accommodations, which is very helpful because the student does not need to report what they think they need and try to haggle with our professors. We've done that work for them. So they're going to have that accommodation plan. They're going to submit it. They're going to have a conversation with the professor. And those accommodation plans, again, are leveling that playing field to ensure that the students have equal access to demonstrate the knowledge of class subjects. I think it's really important to note that we are not accommodating to guarantee succession, but what we are doing is we are providing accommodations so that they have equal opportunity. Students come to learn, right? You go to college to learn, you want to learn. And so we want all of our students to be able to effectively demonstrate that knowledge. And that might look different for all students. In terms of the amount of time allowed on an exam, it might impact the deliverable itself and how the method used to complete that deliverable might look different from student A to student B, but the bottom line is they're still being assessed in the subject matter.
And if I can jump in, a good example, so I love what Stephanie's saying about leveling the playing field. And a good example that someone once gave me to really simplify what an accommodation is a sports game, right? So pick your favorite sport, and I am very short, very little, 5 feet tall. And pretend that I'm at a sporting event with someone who's very tall, 7 feet tall. There's a fence. If they can see the game over the fence just fine, they can see all the players, but when I look, all I can see is the fence. An accommodation would be giving me a step or some stairs to see over the fence. Do I have an unfair advantage because I can now see the same game as the person I'm with? The answer is no. We've simply given me the opportunity to see over the fence and access the same game. If I choose not to use the step ladder, that's my choice. I just won't see the game. So when Stephanie's saying students have an equal opportunity to succeed, if a student chooses not to use their accommodation, that's their choice. We're not guaranteeing A pluses in all of their classes. We're just giving them the tools they need in order to equally access the class.
I think it's a good time too to mention another example that we typically use right around this time in our presentations is, when Steph was talking about visible diagnoses versus invisible diagnoses. So when you see a student or a person in a wheelchair, it's your head inside your brain makes that connection that, okay, the student needs the wheelchair to get around campus. Without the wheelchair, they can't navigate the campus. And it makes sense in your head, and you're like, oh, okay. It becomes a little tougher when we're talking about the invisible disabilities, because we're then linking, 2, 3, 4, 5, accommodations to this invisible disability, but your brain can't make sense of it. And that's actually something that we've done a lot of training with our faculty on, that it doesn't need to make sense, right? Your brain does not need to understand why a student would get certain accommodations. That's our job. And so we've really tried to increase our presence on campus as the disability experts so that we are the go-to for faculty, for staff, for students who have questions, and so that we can give those general examples of why we would approve certain accommodations. Okay, so this is super important, confidentiality. So we tell all of our students, all disability related information is confidential. So it is not part of the student's academic file or transcript. We have our own separate system and process for keeping records. Students need to give permission to our office to release information outside of the university. So that would include parents, friends, family, internships, employers. Those groups of people have no knowledge or access to a student's information unless, one, the student chooses to disclose themselves or gives us permission to do so. Another thing to note is that diagnoses are never given to faculty. That is confidential. And so what on their accommodation plan, what it says is it says the semester that it applies to, it says the student's name, and then it lists off all of the accommodations that are approved. We may share information to staff who have a legitimate educational interest that we deem appropriate. So that could include the health center, it could include the counseling center, it could include our academic advising staff. Typically, it is somebody on campus that is not faculty that is involved in helping that student and may need more information to be the most effective help possible. Oh, you're muted, Steph.
I got excited. I forgot to unmute. So this is a screenshot of the electronic accommodation plan that we've been using, virtually over Zoom, but there's this we would also print as a hard copy when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, so students can physically hand it to their professor. But what you see is we make it very, very clear that it's a confidential document. So professors, their faculty should treat it as such. We offer a time span for which the accommodation is valid. So students who have learning disabilities or ADHD, physical disabilities, those things are unchanging for the most part. So we might make their plan valid through their graduation after we've spent a couple semesters accommodating them. Students with psychological disabilities or temporary disabilities such as concussions or injuries, they'll have a semester by semester plan just because those conditions can be changing. And we would want to reassess the impact and what accommodations are appropriate. We then include the student's name so that their name is on that document. And then what we have below is a general template of the accommodations that are commonly approved. As Stephanie said, accommodations are a very individualized process. So we do have a section at the bottom where we can include additional accommodations that students might need based on their impact and their diagnosis. But you'll see we have things like extended testing time, time and a half versus double time, reading assistance if they need a reader, if they need to read out loud, if they need to clarify exam questions with their professor. We have a use of computer for typing. So again, in this virtual world, of course, students are going to use their computers right now while they learn remotely. But in the classroom setting, physically, sometimes professors don't allow laptops due to how they choose to run their classroom, in which case we could approve a computer for someone who needs one due to their disability. Calculator use, being able to reschedule exams so that there isn't more than one on the same day. We have access to lecture notes or materials, or maybe we arrange for a peer to share their class notes if a student is unable to either take notes physically themselves or listen to the professor and process and write notes at the same time. Sometimes students can record lectures. And then for those physical disabilities or medical conditions, we need students to be able to access things, whether that's the restroom, food and drinks, medical supplies, or the health center. We also have added a section on in the event of a campus emergency, the student will need physical assistance. So that's a very, very critical part of an accommodation plan because it generates a conversation between the student and their teacher, their professor, to identify what kind of help they will need in an emergency. Additionally, if a student has this box checked, we've connected them with university police so that they can talk to the emergency responders about what they might need should an emergency arise. So some accommodations that students commonly have, I did touch on them on the accommodation plan. The extra time if they need time to read, to process their questions and then generate their answers. Students might have a note taker. We have distraction reduced exam settings. Again, in this virtual world over Zoom, students are responsible for finding their own distraction reduced setting, but we also have a small test room available at our office where students can have a distraction reduced area. We very specifically say distraction reduced because it is impossible to eliminate all distractions. They could be in there with someone whose breathing is loud and it distracts them a little bit. And that's just the nature of taking an exam. Electronic text, some students might use assistive technology that has their computer read their textbooks out loud, so they need an electronic version. There can be things like sign language interpreters or special assistive listening devices. Recently, we have added clear masks for the faculty. So masks are mandated due to the pandemic for people that are taking classes physically on campus. So for students that are deaf or hard of hearing and rely on lip reading, we do have clear masks available. Some students might need extensions if they have an unexpected flare-up of symptoms, or they might need flexibility with attendance. Someone with a gastrointestinal based diagnosis might not be able to go to class due to illness. We have that exam rescheduling. And then there might be things around participation, like Stephanie mentioned, if it's appropriate, a student might work with a professor on a different structure. So if they're unable to present in front of the class for some reason and it doesn't change the assignment, maybe they can just present in front of the professor, for example. And then another accommodation that is very, very critical for students is early registration for classes. That way they can consider medications, right? So some people with attentional diagnoses have medication that makes them focus, but it only lasts a certain time period. Some students, mornings are hard or nights are hard, so they can plan around that. And we also want students to be able to budget in breaks or meal times depending on their diagnosis.
Okay, so now that Steph has reviewed the different types of accommodations that we see, we wanted to spend just a few minutes linking 2 or 3 of those accommodations to each class of diagnoses, so that we can give you a good picture as to how we accommodate. So for learning disabilities, a very common accommodation is, as we've been mentioning time and time again, is extra time on timed deliverables. So that would be anything that's timed: pop quizzes, timed writing reflections, exams, midterms, finals. So extra time is definitely a big one for learning disabilities. Another big one is exam rescheduling when they have more than one on the same day. And so we do that so that students who are getting extra time on their exams and that's typically if there's a learning disability, it's because the processing of some area of their learning is impacted. We don't want them to have to take 2 exams on one day with extra time. So we would allow the student to reschedule. Another accommodation for learning disabilities could be the use of a note sharer. So especially if there are issues in auditory processing or writing, getting main ideas down, we would actually link them to a student in the class, and that student would provide our student with a copy of their notes. The professor actually helps us find someone who wants to volunteer to do that. And in my 12 years at Bentley, we've never had an issue finding a student who wants to help. For ADHD, again, extra time is super important because of the high distractibility that ADHD causes. A separate, as Steph mentioned, the separate testing location. So we say again, distraction reduced. Typically that means no more than 10 students in a given room. Whereas our regular classes could range from 20 to 30 students in a room. And again, that is pre-COVID. Right now, everyone has a distraction-free testing location. Another accommodation that Steph mentioned is that early registration is very applicable for both learning disabilities and ADHD. On the ADHD side, because they're taking a stimulant medication, we want to ensure that they're taking classes when their medication is active. We also want them to avoid classes that are double blocks because that you need to sustain attention for longer, and that might be a struggle. We approve early registration for learning disabilities so that they're able to plan out their day accordingly, so that they can take 2 classes per day. They can make sure there are breaks in between so that they're not stuck taking 2 or 3 classes in a row. That's really important, especially where if a student is getting extra time on an exam, if they have back-to-back classes, they now have to schedule a completely different day and time with the professor to take that exam. For psychological diagnoses, so this is a much more broad topic, so it can include things like anxiety and depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder. So as we mentioned before, it's a highly interactive process between us and the student to determine what's reasonable and necessary. But again, the early registration typically is necessary to ensure that they are taking classes at a time that's good for them, especially if there's medication involved. We typically do see the extra time on exams due to, for example, if there's obsessive compulsive disorder and they're engaging in obsessive and compulsive behaviors while they're taking an exam, it's going to take them longer to complete it. We also have a lot of students who are diagnosed just with generalized anxiety, and the anxiety that they have during an exam, looking at the clock, if people are leaving, impacts their ability to get through the exam in a timely manner. Exam rescheduling, again, with psychological disabilities, due to being able to spread it out, so to keep the anxiety kind of at bay. We also, in terms of psychological disabilities, will do alternate arrangements in lieu of participation. So oftentimes our students with severe anxiety might have a great one-to-one communication and relationship with their professor to demonstrate that they are doing the readings, that they can talk about the material, and that they can submit their thoughts just directly to the professor instead of having to report in front of 30 students. We also have flexibility with attendance, and actually this is a good transition to the medical diagnoses that Steph Bowler will talk about, but we do have flexibility with attendance, and a lot of faculty have their own policies in terms of how many classes a student can miss. Due to the nature of some psychological diagnoses, it may be necessary for a student to have to miss class. And we don't want our student to be penalized for that. And so they're allowed to work one-on-one with their faculty member, their professor, to see what work they missed and to submit their work. However, it is a bit of a gray area, because we can't have a student missing half the semester, because then they're not meeting the standards of the course. And accommodations are not meant to impact the standards of a course. We have to keep that integrity. And so we typically will give flexibility for up to 2 weeks of class over any given semester. Once a student misses 2 weeks of class, that's when we're having a conversation with the student and the professor to determine, can they still complete the course? Can we make a plan to submit work? Are they able to demonstrate their knowledge without having been in class? So it really is a group effort. And I say it's a transitional accommodation because that accommodation is absolutely applied to many medical diagnoses.
So, you know, at this point, and Stephanie hit the nail on the head here, with a lot of these accommodations can be used for different diagnoses, right? And it's used for different reasons. And another thing that Stephanie mentioned, and I hope that you keep in mind, is that so much of this relies on communication. The student communicating with the faculty, us communicating with the faculty communicating with us and the student. So it's a very, group effort, like Stephanie said. So with medical diagnoses, some examples include IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. That's something that involves the gastrointestinal tract. So it involves the restroom and frequent and urgent bathroom use. So if someone is having an extreme flare-up, they actually might not be able to leave the bathroom for an extended period of time, which means that they then can't go to class during that flare-up, right? So in that case, the flexibility with attendance makes a lot of sense because the student physically cannot make it to class. They'd email their professor, and then they'd talk to them when they're better about how to make up the work missed and get any material that they missed. Someone with diabetes, for example, that's a diagnosis that deals with blood sugar. If someone has to deal with a drop in their blood sugar, that's an emergency, and they are going to have to leave the class to tend to that. So in that case, the person might need some flexibility with attendance. They're definitely going to need access to medical supplies so that they can check their blood sugars. Things like that. In terms of physical disabilities, things like blind or visual impairments, folks, if they are deaf or hard of hearing, that's going to involve some coordination, perhaps with assistive technology. So someone who's blind or visually impaired might rely on the e-textbooks so that their computer can read it to them. They might have a guide dog in class. Legally, they're allowed to have that. It's a service dog. Someone who's deaf, hard of hearing, they might have an FM transmitter, which the professor wears a microphone that transmits directly to the student's hearing aid. Nobody else can hear it. And then there's the basic things that I think we take for granted. So wheelchair ramps, wheelchair lifts, special seating, things that, again, with those physical visible disabilities, it's pretty automatic in terms of people automatically assisting with that. And then autism and Asperger's, it's very much based on social behavior. A student might need more explicit and clear instruction from the professor because they have difficulty following a lot of convoluted conversation or material. Someone with autism or Asperger's might need certain social cues. They might need the professor to let them know before they're planning on calling on them. Those types of accommodations. So it's very different across the board based on the diagnosis, but you are going to see similar accommodations, but for very different impacts and reasons.
So just some other areas to think about in terms of accommodations include transportation. So we actually have on our campus, we're situated on a hill. And so it makes, especially for students with physical diagnoses or medical conditions, it can be difficult to travel. So we actually have a shuttle bus that goes around. It is ADA accessible, which means it is wheelchair accessible. Building access. So are there entrances on the level ground? Food plans. So some students have, GI disorders or food allergies that would entitle them to accommodate. They would be eligible for accommodations. In terms of the more physical accommodations, things like curb cuts, so that students with wheelchairs, students who are using canes, students who are on crutches, we also serve students with injuries. And so you want to ensure that the students have accessibility on campus. Elevators in the buildings, ramps, access to assistance. Where is campus police and how can they get a hold of them? Dorm accommodations. So we actually have a special committee that meets once a semester and reviews students' applications for the res halls accommodations. So things like singles, use of a bathroom, being on the first floor. So while Steph and I mainly deal with I would say 90% of our job is on those academic accommodations, we do participate in other groups and committees on campus when there is a need for accommodations to level the playing field, make sure everyone has equal access.
So we're going to show you a quick video that is a group of individuals who have different disabilities sharing what they would like people to know. People who don't necessarily have a disability might not understand these aspects, and so they want to share them.
Development, HR, creative production.
I so often hear people send the message like, thank God that's not me, when they see someone with a disability, or like, thank God that's not me or my kid. And that's sending the message that disability is equal to someone who is less than or broken or incomplete, and that's not the case.
Well, I have cerebral palsy. Affects me pretty much from the hips down, and also just like fine motor control and things like that.
So I have Tourette syndrome, which is a neurological disorder, which means I do movements and noises that I can't control.
I have cerebral palsy, as well as left hemiparesis and nystagmus, which means that my whole left side is weaker than my right.
I have a very aggressive form of lupus, and I have a blood clotting disorder associated with my lupus. And 4 years ago, I had a clot in my foot. And then this happened. In over 8 months and 11 surgeries, this was the end.
I love having Tourette's. I love that I'm 4'7". I love my obsessive compulsive disorder. And I think that's the case that many of us have embraced our disabilities.
I've had my disability since I was born, and it's a part of me.
My brain is quick and witty and wildly inappropriate, and it also has Tourette's. And at some point, I decided not to just love parts of my brain. A lot of times I see kids staring at me. That's okay with me.
I welcome it. Kids are curious.
But what I struggle with is when a parent shushes them or quickly pulls them in the other direction.
When a child is hustled away from a person or hushed, it stigmatizes even just asking the question.
Because kids then associate disability with feeling ashamed.
And if they've never seen anything like this before, they're gonna look. And if they have questions, let them ask. There's nothing wrong with that.
So instead, I hope that parents say things like, how cool that we all move differently and walk differently and talk differently, more than just like normalizing disability, but celebrating it. We date. People with disabilities date, and not always other people with disabilities.
Just because I have a disability doesn't mean I have to be paired with somebody with a disability.
Direct message to everyone in my life, but if you're gonna set me up on a blind date, please have more criteria than this guy also has a disability.
Not every single person with a disability is in a wheelchair. I am not in a wheelchair. I've never been in a wheelchair.
If one more person calls me an inspiration after just meeting me, I'm gonna burn your house down.
We aren't inherently inspirational or brave because we are disabled, which is kind of the idea that people think about when they say that.
It's okay to call me an inspiration once you know me or know something about me, but genetics does not make me an inspiration. Let me earn that word.
There are people who are actually doing amazing, brave things out there, whether they have a disability or not.
But it comes across to a disabled person as, wow, I'm so happy that I'm not in your shoes.
I get a lot of strangers trying to help me up the steps by grabbing my arm or my waist or something, and that's extremely inappropriate.
You can say, hey, do you need some help? Rather than just either forcing my chair or ignoring me. It took me a while to actually call myself a person with a disability, but I'm a person first. Being an amputee is secondary.
I'd rather have somebody say I'm a person with a disability rather than being disabled because of the whole control and ownership issue.
I hear differently abled. Ugh, the word is disability.
I used to call myself like differently abled, and some people didn't like that, and I'm just like, but I am different. And they're like, no, you're not. And it took me a while to actually see that I was using very able-bodied terms.
It should be a descriptor, just like I'm right-handed, I have a disability. When we're talking about disabilities, I hear the word that we want to be accommodating, which is great, or we're working on tolerance. Nobody wants to just be tolerated. Like, I tolerated those 3 years my sister was learning to play the trombone. I tolerate going to the dentist. None of these things are things I like, they're things I tolerate because I know that I have to deal with. So there's such an important step in communities between opening the door to somebody with a disability and like embracing them and building a community with them in mind.
So while she's putting the presentation back up, some key takeaways from that are the idea of the person first. You don't want to identify the disability before the person. A person is a human being. They're a brother, a sister, a ballerina, a teacher, but they also have a disability. Another key takeaway is that you want to embrace the disability, and there's an appropriate way to do it. Again, there's no tolerating, it's welcoming. Everybody is different. People have different strengths, different weaknesses. And then you also don't want to inappropriately help someone. You don't want to grab someone and move them. You don't want to grab someone's equipment, like a wheelchair or crutches, and move it. You want to ask someone first. You wouldn't just grab someone's legs and make them walk faster. So you shouldn't just grab someone's wheelchair and make it go faster.
It's really important to note that, so a lot of schools in the US, their office name changes. So we're disability services. At another school, it might be accessibility services. At another school, it might be support services. We have embraced disability services for many of the reasons that this video touched upon. It is a piece of the person. It is not the person in its entirety, and it's not something that should be pushed aside and hidden under a cover. We are disability services. We are a piece of the diverse experience within Bentley. And we're really proud of that. Boom.
Don't be shy about questions. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Go ahead, Steph. We have a lot of questions though.
Good, perfect. Get them going.
Perfect. Thank you, Stephanie, for all the information. This is great. I will start actually with a question, confirm some of the information. The first question is, are there any accommodations, there are, in the admissions process, but perhaps such as extended deadlines, lower test scores? Maybe this is something different from what you mentioned before.
Yes, so at Bentley, those accommodations don't exist. And so when we talked about meeting the standards of a program, those standards still need to be met. So students, there is a range for those SAT scores. There is certain criteria that students need to meet to be eligible to attend Bentley. So the disability services process is actually completely separate from the admissions process. Once a student is admitted, they then would apply to disability services for accommodations. There's no reason to disclose during the admissions process either. That's completely up to the student. But no, so students do need to meet the admissions standards to ensure the integrity of our program.
Perfect. Super. I will continue with the next. What would be required from an international student with a disability in the application process?
In terms of the application process to Bentley, again, that process would not change if a person has a disability or not. All those standards are the same. In terms of an international student registering and requesting accommodations with our office, we would still want to see the same things in terms of the medical documentation, the history, any past accommodation plans. But that said, we understand that the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, is only in the United States, and that different countries have different healthcare systems and different relationships with disability. So we do work with students on a case-by-case basis, with some flexibility in terms of if they don't have a history of accommodations, or if they're unable to get the super specific documentation because of the healthcare in their country. We'll work with them in order to help them get what they need with what they have available to them.
Perfect. Thank you, Steph. Another question regarding accommodations actually is, if the accommodations are for students with disabilities are the same around all U.S. universities, is this something required?
Yes.
Or they need to ask when applying to a specific university about this?
That is a great question. So the ADA applies to all higher education institutions in the US. So every single higher education institution is going to have some form of what we're talking about. Their process may be different. So I would absolutely encourage students to reach out to the disability support services at the institutions that they're interested in to get a feel for the office, to get a feel for the providers. But in terms of the basic services, they have to be the same because it's a legal mandate, which is the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Yeah, that's very important to know. Another question, what are your recommendations, or what recommendations can you give to students with disabilities to integrate themselves into the new college environment?
I think that that's a really great question. I think that, you know, it's important that students have an open mind and explore. So often we find first year students are discovering so much about themselves, whether they have a disability or not. So I would say two things. One is explore the student groups and the activities on campus, join some clubs, even if it's a little scary to get involved, or you're anxious, or you aren't great socially. It's so important to find people that share common interests. And then the other recommendation I have is learn your resources on campus. Learn different people who can help you. So disability services, learn about Greek life, learn about career services, advising services, because those folks are going to be the ones that also help you to get involved on campus and get your footing in this new kind of land that you're in, because college is very different from the other schools and high schools, elementary school.
Perfect. In this sense, about talking about these resources that the universities are offering, is this something that everyone knows? Like, for instance, not just this information about these services and accommodations and everything is just given to students with disabilities, or to everyone?
That's a great question too. So as a new student, it is really overwhelming when you get to campus, because there's just so much knowledge out there as to how the campus is made up. What I recommend to students is to try to find one person, one professional on campus that can kind of explain where all the supports are and where the services are offered. I know Bentley does a great job in terms of orientation, and that there are webinars and there are publications that get emailed out. And a lot of times it's overwhelming to students, right? Going through all the webinars and going through all the reading materials. So what I would encourage students to do is to keep track of all of those materials and maybe file them in a folder, so that at their own pace, they can go back and kind of start reading through to see how the campus is made up. But also, for example, the students who come see Steph and I use us as a campus resource. So they may ask us, what other supports are available? Where can I go to tweak my resume? Okay, well, if I'm having an issue with my roommate, where do I go? And so this isn't just applicable to students with disabilities, it's applicable to all new students. It's a whole new process to learn. So getting to know your RA, getting to know your academic advisor, these are all the people who you really want to have face-to-face with masks interactions with, because they're the ones that can help you.
Perfect. Yeah, there is another question. I would like to know if disabilities can limit the classes one takes.
So how I'm interpreting that question is, does someone's disability impact what courses they might want to take? Is that the question?
Yes, I think that's the sense of the question. I think it is that as well.
I think yes, but you also need to think of it as strengths and weaknesses, right? So, I don't have a math-based disability. However, I am terrible at math. You do not want me working numbers for you. So I chose in college not to take math courses because it wasn't a strength. So when someone assesses their disability, someone with a writing-based disability might want to steer clear of the classes that are going to be very heavy in writing, right? You are going to have some core curriculum requirements. So Bentley has required classes for all students, basically. There's a math requirement, there's a basic writing requirement, but then what classes you take after your first year is up to you, and you pick what's called a major. And when we advise students in deciding their major, we think of things like, what do you enjoy doing, right? What are their strengths academically? What are your weaknesses? If you are someone who is terrified of speaking in front of groups of people, or you have a communication-based disability that affects verbal communication, you might not want to pick a major that involves you getting up in front of people for your career.
And you will always be with your counselor, right? Do you have a counselor at the universities, and they can help as well?
Yep, so a lot of universities will have some form of academic advising where they're assigned an advisor. For example, when I was at Stonehill, we didn't have an advising department, but I was assigned a person on campus who was my advisor to guide me through that. Bentley actually has a whole department called academic advising with professional advisors who will walk students through the process of choosing a major, choosing classes. Stephanie and I help students to choose classes. So people have a lot of guidance at the college level.
And in this case, when they have this, like any condition, there will be also communication between the, so to say, the services for students with disabilities and the counselor or the academic advisor.
Go ahead, Steph.
No, go ahead, Stephanie.
Oh, I was going to say, so that is actually up to the student. So like we said before, it's actually not noted anywhere in their academic file or transcript that they are registered with us. So if a student is meeting with an academic advisor and wants feedback on classes, timing, professors, due to their diagnosis, they would have to disclose at that point in time. So we don't send out our list of registered students to our staff on campus.
Oh, perfect. Okay, up to the student then.
Mm-hmm.
Another question, Liz, can we make a couple of other questions? Is that okay? Yeah.
Yes,
because
please.
we are running out of time, but.
Oh, absolutely, keep going.
Perfect. If I don't know about that medical condition and what do they need, what do I do to help in this pandemic? I guess, yeah, the student is asking not about her or his condition, but about the medical condition, about other, I think, because it says, if I don't know about that medical condition and what do they need, what do I do to help this pandemic?
So how I'm interpreting that question is if a student comes to our school and now they are suspecting that something is impacting their academics, but they didn't come to our school knowing they had a diagnosis. Is that what you're saying?
Well, how do you interpret? I don't know about that medical condition and what do they need. I interpret it more like if I am a student, how can I do during this pandemic if I don't know about their medical condition or someone else's condition, and what do they need? I think
we offer consult services where students can actually just book a consultation appointment with us to discuss what their experience has been. And then we would properly advise them on who to go to get that diagnosis or get that assessment that would provide feedback on impact and give us information necessary to determine eligibility for accommodations.
There is, yes, Steph?
Well, I was also going to say, I was interpreting it more as if I'm sick and need help in the middle of this pandemic. And I do just want to say, if someone has a temporary illness, like, oh, I have a stomach ache, oh, I have a headache. Most American colleges and universities have a health center or some kind of a doctor's office on campus for students. And they can assist students with basic care. They don't have x-ray machines or things that a specialist would have, but they do, treat students who might have a fever, who might be sick. Bentley specifically in this COVID era is doing weekly testing for students, or if a student has COVID symptoms and needs, on the spot testing, they can get that as well. So there is healthcare on campus, and part of being a student on Bentley's campus is also a student health insurance plan that you can purchase so that when you're here, you have a plan. So at Bentley, it's Blue Cross. And then that also gets you access to other healthcare off campus if you have something more in depth that requires specialized examination like an x-ray or an MRI.
And I actually think that health insurance is mandatory for international students, so they actually have to get that plan. It's also important to note that for students who are coming to our office for services, it's not considered a disability unless the condition is going to last 6 weeks or longer. So if there is a medical concern where a student is not feeling well and they're missing class and they need some help, that would actually be referred to academic services for assistance, unless there is a diagnosis that is going to impact the student for more than 6 weeks. Then the student would come to us.
Here is another very quick question, I think. What would the procedure be that a student needs to follow in order to take his or her helper with him or her, or in case that he or she would like to hire one in the US?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Oh,
Sure.
it's an aid. It's a
an aid,
one-on-one aid. So if a student has a one-on-one aid, a personal assistant,
Yeah.
if it's someone who, again, we would need the documentation and we would need to approve it. But for example, I've worked with a student who was a paraplegic, which means that their arms didn't work in their case, and they had a physical assistant that did things like go to class with them and hold the textbook, turn the pages. They helped carry the students' things, and that's not something that the university provides because it's considered a personal medical. I don't want to say piece of equipment because it's a human being that's the aid, but it is personal medical
service
equipment. But that is something that a student can have. They would just provide it themselves.
Okay, perfect. But not to have someone at the US, like to hire someone in the US.
There are agencies in the United States where a student would work likely with a social worker who would then connect them to a personal aid.
Oh, perfect. Just a couple of more questions. Is there access to students with physical disabilities so they can move around independently without any problem?
Yes, we have many students who meet that definition.
Yeah, okay, perfect. If, for instance, the student gets a condition, not before, so this student is not telling you no because there is no condition, but for instance, get depressed, especially with the cultural shock, perhaps, or any other reason during the studies. What to do then?
Yeah, so the student, so in that case, what would most likely happen is the student would visit our counseling center and work with one of our counselors to address their concerns. And if the counselor felt they needed disability services, then they would then refer the student to us.
Okay, perfect. If is in your experience, have there been any situations of disrespect to students with disabilities? And do you work with those students so they can respect the disabilities from other students?
Do you want me to take that, Bowles?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I've been on Bentley's campus for 12 years, and I honestly can't think of an example where a student was targeted because of a disability. In terms of us working with students who may have bias, pre-COVID, Steph and I ran disability awareness events so that we could help provide knowledge to all of the groups on campus. So not just students, but faculty and staff as well. We would host panel discussions. We would have info tables. We would give out t-shirts. We would have a pledge to sign for students. And so it was more about increasing awareness to decrease the stigma.
And I also, we welcome conversations with students. So I've had a student come to me and say, I had this interaction with a professor. I don't know if it's because I have a disability or not. And we would work with the student to guide them through either talking to the professor themselves, or we mediate a conversation. And so far, during any of those types of conversations, the student the professor didn't intend for something to come out the way that it did, or the professor didn't know the specifics around the person's disability and was unintentionally, not accommodating the way that we had, specifically indicated. And then we work through it. But I can't think of a time where I would say there's been intentional disrespect, but we are always open to conversation and working through something.
That's awesome. And the last question, if you haven't gotten any question through your private chats, is any condition reason to deny any application for admission or terminate the participation of any already enrolled student?
No, that would be discrimination. So as we mentioned before, during the admissions process, you actually do not need to disclose your disability at all. You would follow the normal admissions process. And then once admitted, you would apply for accommodations directly to Steph and I. And we would determine what, working with you on a one-to-one basis, we would determine what accommodations are needed. But that is, when we talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act and prohibiting discrimination, that would be illegal. So no.
Super. Perfect. I just want to ask you, have you received any questions to your private chats? No. Thank you to one of the participants, just to end this stage. It says, congratulations to the panelists and organizer of the event. Interesting topic today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Martha. And thank you, Steph, and thank you, Stephanie, for providing us with this awesome information. It is very helpful for all of us, definitely. And yes, now, well, I can say that after receiving this awesome information, we may have understood better what disabilities are, celebrate them. And also, if you, any of our attendees, if you are a student with a disability, please contact us and let's make a plan to start your studies in the United States. We are always here to help you. And also our university reps like Steph and Stephanie, who are here also to help you at any time. Thank you also to my colleagues, Marta, Elvira, and Anna, who are here. And thanks to all of you who attended our webinar. Thank you all and see you very soon.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you. And Steffi and Steph, could you please stay for a picture, for taking a picture?
Sure.
Yes, with Martha, Elvira, Anna. Okay. Okay,
but can you stop sharing the presentation so that I can take a screenshot like that? Yeah. Just give me 1 second.
Give us a warning when you're going to do it, okay?
Yes, yes. Of course. All right. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. Thank you so much, guys. This was so interesting and such a very, I think this is something that we need to implement here in Mexico. Universities here, they don't have these resources, so it's very important. So obviously students
let us
are
know.
like,
if you have any other questions, please feel free to email. We're happy to give whatever knowledge we have. We can help.
Thank you so much. I will share it with my host institution